We look forward to a day of learning, meeting a number of people, discerning together what the discipleship looks like, especially for those of us involved in leading, shaping contemporary worship or responding to it in some way. So thanks so much for being here. In the middle of Ephesians 4, there is the beautiful phrase to equip the saints for ministry, and that is exactly what today is about. And toward that end, I invite you to join me in prayer as we begin. Lord our God, we are so grateful for the opportunity to be together from so many parts of the world and so many parts of the church. And we know that the body that you draw together through your Spirit is blessed with so many, many gifts. And we know that your Holy Spirit invites us into a life of discernment and growth. And so we pray today that we will encourage each other, challenge each other to grow deeper in our own walk with you and to think about all the ways in all the roles that we play that we can be involved in giving shape to the life of your church in such a way that many people are called to experience joy in Christ and all of us are called to grow up to full maturity in the body. May you receive all thanks and praise through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. One of the most important things that we will do today is to talk at table. Many of you have begun the introductions already, but would you take time now to take a trip around the table? And I'd like to suggest that you do the first time, because we have to practice a few skills here to move in and out of table discussion and plenary discussion. What I'd like you to try is a fairly quick trip around the table with your name and the hometown that you come from for this conversation. So this is the 59-second blitz trip around the table. On your mark and set, go. All right, thank you very much. Most of the tables made it all the way around the circle, not quite all, but if you didn't, you'll get a chance to continue in just a minute. This is where we're practicing the handoff of the baton. Just be assured that if I jump in like that I'm going to give the baton right back to you to pick up where you left off. Like right now, take a second trip around the circle with the role that you play in congregational life and the number of times that you have been at this conference here at Calvin College. Many of you, first time, a few of you, third time, a few of you, 23rd time. Whatever it is, the role you play in the congregation and the nature of your connection with this event. On your mark and set, go. All right, I'm going to take the baton back. So these, we have to keep moving around that circle pretty fast, right? What I'd like you to do now is to name a particular song that you believe has particularly blessed the Christian church, that comes out of the broad contemporary worship movement. We could spend the whole morning trying to define exactly what we mean by the contemporary worship movement, but just take a stab at something that you associate with the contemporary worship movement, that you want to hold up as something that has genuinely strengthened and blessed you and the life of the church. On your mark and set, go. All right, thank you very much. Throughout the room, there are about 12 different conference presenters scattered throughout the room who are going to be continuing to shape conversations at table and as a whole. And I'd like everybody in that group to stand wherever you are. And we're going to do some introductions. So if, scattered throughout the room here. All right, very good. And so what I'd like to do is just stay standing while we do these introductions.
What do you want us to say, John? A little bit about what you do, who you are. Okay, my name is Lester Ruth, and I'm a full-time professor. I have a great job. I'm a worship historian by training. I teach at Duke Divinity School and the Robert Weber Institute for Worship Studies.
And this past fall, you taught.
I taught a doctoral seminar on the history of contemporary worship at Duke and had great fun.
So we'll be hearing more about that as the day goes on.
Hi, I'm Randall Bradley. I live in Waco, Texas, and I coordinate the church music program at Baylor University, and I also work as the worship minister in a local church.
Right. And have written a book?
A recent book called From Memory to Imagination, Reforming the Church's Music.
Which we'll hear more about later today.
My name is Sharon Veltema. I am the teacher for spiritual growth at Unity Christian High School, which is about a half hour from here. The vast majority of my job is chapel planning. We have chapel 4 mornings a week, and about 80% of our chapels are student-led.
So how many student leaders do you work with?
On my spiritual leadership committee, we have 13. We try to keep it to 12, and those are seniors. And then over the course of the year, we'll have about 250 students involved in worship.
You may all applaud right there. That's it. Sorry.
I'm Greg Shear. I'm on staff here quarter time at the Worship Institute, and then 3/4 time I'm a minister of worship at Church of the Servant. I have a book called The Art of Worship, which is on contemporary worship, which is somewhat ironic if you know my church, which we don't even have a praise band. So, anyways, that's who I am.
And he's written a fabulous setting of Psalm 42 that is currently my kids' #1 favorite song. It's in the hymnal sampler, and it's titled As the Deer, except it's As the Deer, the other version. actually, as that's known. More about EMI and copyrights coming up, all right? There we go. All right, here we go.
Hi, I'm Scott Sherman. I've been primarily a church planter for the last 25 years, first in New York City and now in San Francisco. I lead an institution called Newbegin House of Studies, which is essentially a distance learning seminary program that's connected with Western Theological Seminary, with some ties as well to Calvin Seminary. And I chair the Worship Commission for the Reformed Church in America.
Great, thanks, Scott. Great.
I'm Gerardo Marti. I'm a sociologist at Davidson College in North Carolina.
Can't say a lot about the last book you wrote. Say a little bit about the last book.
And the book that I had most recently published from Oxford University Press is called Worship Across the Racial Divide. It's a close look at worship and music and how it works in racially diverse churches. It's not what you think.
All right, Gerardo. More about that this afternoon.
I'm Jae-woo Kim, originally from South Korea, but now lives in Dallas, Texas. So I consider myself Korean Texan. And I'm a worship art missionary with mission agency called Artists in Christian Testimonies. My main job is to train and mobilize worship leaders and artists for global missions. I'm one of many authors who recently compiled the ethnodoxology handbook, Worship and Mission for the Global Church.
And we'll be leading the Korean Vesper service this afternoon. So, very good. Claudia.
Bom dia. My name is Claudio. I'm from Brazil. I'm now teaching worship at Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And I have a book coming out which is called Sacraments and Globalization, Redrawing the Lines of Eucharistic Hospitality.
All right, very good.
I'm Carol Hochhalter, and I teach worship to undergrads at Kuiper College, right down the road. My home church of many years is Park Church, and they've recently hired a great new worship director. So I'm in the search mode. We're looking for a church. Hey, there he is. Yeah, I'm a graduate of IWS, and Rich is a student at IWS, Institute for Worship Studies. So a lot of my teaching is influenced by people like Lester Ruth and Bob Weber and John Whitley.
Oh, well. Can you figure out that actually what we're going to be talking about today is going to be filtered into about 72 different seminary classes, that some of which start next week, right? So the conversations are actually have a particular potency because of that.
I'm Brad Berglund. I teach as an adjunct at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. I pray in a Teze style, lead Teze style prayer each Sunday night in Denver when I'm home at a community called The Threshold. And I've written a book called Reinventing Sunday, published by Judson Press. And I lead ecumenical pilgrimage around the world.
Thanks, Brad. And be leading Teze prayer during the Vesper time at 5 o'clock as well. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Brad O'Donnell. I'm the vice president of A&R at EMI CMG Records in Nashville, Tennessee. So work in the Christian music division of EMI Records. I get to work with a lot of great worship artists in particular. Chris Tomlin, David Crowder, Matt Redman, Carrie Job, Hillsong. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much.
My name is Greg Thompson. I'm the senior pastor of a Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlottesville, Virginia. And some of you will know Isaac Wardell from Bifrost Arts. He's our director for worship, so I'm involved in Bifrost Arts movement. I also do scholarly work on the civil rights movement at the Institute, at a place called the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. I've been there for, I guess, about 7 years. And so a lot of my work is about the relationship between corporate worship and communities and also like civil rights stuff. And some of you have probably seen Nicholas Walderstorff's book, Liturgy, Justice, Church, and World. I edited that volume with Mark Gornick. So I'm very grateful to be here.
Great. Terrific. That's great.
So I'm John Thompson, no relation, but I'm a big fan of this Thompson. I'm the director of creative and copyright development at what is now called Capital CMG Publishing, that was EMI CMG Publishing, and we work with songwriters and songs. And so if you've ever heard of worshiptogether.com, that's one of our tools that we use to introduce new worship songs to the church. Personally, I've been a worship leader for 24 years, originally in Chicago and now living in East Nashville, and still leading worship on a regular basis. Also a home group leader, and I wrote a book 10 years ago called Raised by Wolves, the story of Christian rock and roll. So if any of you want a little lowbrow reading, I would, maybe you could tolerate that book for a little bit. But I've been sort of a historian and fan and advocate for everything from the Jesus movement era through, and kind of watching that evolution. I also am a songwriter and artist with my wife, and we travel around and lead worship at schools and conferences and bars and hoot nannies and wherever people will have us. So glad to be here.
So great to have you here. And Steve Guthrie.
I'm Steve Guthrie, and I was for 15 years, actually, I figured this out the other day, was a director of music, 7 years on staff, and then 8 years volunteering at various churches, and was a musician in rock bands and doing some touring and recording. My second incarnation has been as a professor of theology, so I teach theology at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, and I lead a program there called Religion and the Arts. And this semester, actually, I'm teaching a course on theology and worship, from which I'm learning a great deal.
Thanks, Steve. And spent last spring as a scholar in residence here at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and we were richly blessed with Steve's presence. We'll be hearing more from him in just a bit. Discipleship in the era of contemporary worship is a huge topic. We can't begin to exhaust it today, but we can make some significant progress at coming to understand things in a new, deeper way. And what we want to leave with today, a little bit like prayer time at your church, we want to leave today with a more robust list of things to thank God for. Our gratitude list we want to grow. The things that we are grateful for, the ways that God has strengthened and blessed the church through this movement. The second thing we want to leave with is a prayer list. Things that we want to be praying for in the future of worship life of North American congregations. And our prayers need to track God's call to discipleship in all its fullness. And so as the day continues, be thinking about those points of gratitude and those points of petition so that our prayers can lean more deeply toward what God is calling each of us to be. The contemporary, for the next little while, what I'd like to do is have us put on the hat of historian or journalist that thinks about the shaping of this worship movement over the past generation. So for a little while, don't worry about the songs you're going to pick next Sunday. Don't worry about the songs that you may be choosing if you're a part of a songbook project or some other group that's curating a group of songs to be used in your congregation's diet. Don't worry so much about the pro and con conversations that your church may be having about worship style one way, but let's try to enter in to a way of understanding how this movement has emerged. Now, I'm going to put Lester Ruth on the spot in about 3 minutes to say a word about his Duke seminar this fall, but I'll say that in my own teaching, when we talk about the history of the contemporary worship movement, we often talk about it as the fusion, the powerful fusion of 3 or 4 very distinct movements. One of them is the vast growth of youth culture in the United States and all that it stands for. Something that far transcends the life of the church, but has remade the music and the nature of how culture functions. It's shaped by social media, by how the music industry has changed, but this larger movement around youth culture has been obviously huge. Within the life of the church, there are 2 other things that have fed this fusion experiment, and they are quite different things. One of them is the charismatic movement that was shaped out of the late 60s that had at its heart a passion for deep charismatic worship, the experience of the Holy Spirit, often including the gifts of the Holy Spirit in many of its manifestations, understood very differently in terms of how the Spirit works, speaking in tongues and healing. But what is common is this passion to experience God, this deeply experiential passion. On the other hand, feeding this fusion has been the desire of the church to reach out to culture, to be relevant to culture, to engage in mission to culture. And that's distinct from the passion around experiencing God. It's related to, but distinct from. And you can often feel in conversations around this topic that some people represent the experiencing God passion, and some people represent the connect with culture passion. And sometimes people make assumptions about the fact that everybody in the conversation is involving, equally has embraced all of those ways of speaking and central concerns. So one way to understand the history then is this three-part fusion of passion to connect, passion to experience God, right alongside of the transformation of youth culture. Now, when historians talk about how history is told, they use a big fancy word called historiography, which you can actually just use once today and think, wow, I used the 95-cent word at the Calvin Symposium on Worship. So Lester Ruth and I are now engaged in this improvisatory conversation about historiography. Lester, what's your analysis of this three-part fusion model for thinking about this history?
I think you're very, very right on, John. If I can make an important distinction, it's almost difficult to talk about contemporary worship. We're also familiar with the term now. It's quite striking to realize that if we're talking about a phenomenon that's half a century old now, that term is not, it comes after the halfway mark of the phenomenon. So that what you're talking about in the 50s and the 60s and 70s is the emergence of new forms without that term contemporary worship. There are multiple sources of origin. I mean, some interesting ones. There's a jazz adaptation of morning prayer for a National Methodist Youth Meeting in 1959. There's a record. I actually own it.
Here's a Methodist trying to have the Methodists take claim to being the fountain source of the contemporary worship movement. I just want to point this out.
Yes. Yes. Well, so let me back up. Let me give justice to somebody else. In terms of the writing of the history of contemporary worship, generally the people who are foremost in this are musicologists and ethnomusicologists, so it's easier to tie down the history of the musical aspect of it. It's folks who would deal with architecture, use of scripture, changes in prayer, changes in preaching form, development of the visual media aspect. Those aspects, I tell you what, if you're a graduate student looking for a dissertation topic, there's a whole wide range of them right now.
All right, and there's only 10 people in the room who want to direct the dissertation, so how's that right here? So I'd like you at your table to talk about the characteristics of what you think of when you think of contemporary worship. A quick list of characteristics. What comprises it? What makes it up? How would you know if you experienced it? One hint, half of you experienced it in worship this morning and half of you didn't, because the two morning services are so different here at Calvin, right? But what comes to mind when you think of contemporary worship? On your mark and set, go. All right, if I could ask for your attention again. So what a list of things I overheard, everything from screens to praise band. Other people were talking about attitudes of the heart that they associate with contemporary worship. Other people were associating with different forms of renewal. Some people went to the time the worship service happened, Saturday night at 5:30 instead of Sunday morning at 10. Really, at the tables, the conversations went in many directions, just the few tables that I overheard, and I'm guessing that if we were to get a comprehensive list, that we would keep a historian like Lester busy for an entire year just to sort it out. We won't wind up with a clean, neat history or picture, but we think we have a wonderful way of drawing us in to a deeper understanding of all that has happened by focusing today on a particular city, the city of Nashville, Tennessee. And so I'm going to invite Steve Guthrie now, and we can have the lights lowered a little bit. Steve is going to become the travel guide to why Nashville is a city we need to pay attention to.
Why do you want the lights lowered when I come up? What are you saying, John? Well, hello. It's good to be your travel guide to Nashville. I've been in Nashville for 7 years, but still feel like a relative newcomer. I never lived in the South before and actually came to Nashville from 8 years in the UK. So I've been learning my way around this culture. Here is just a sketch of some of the things that I've learned in my time there. It's been an extraordinary education. Here are some notes from Music City. Do you see what I did there? You see what I did there? Yeah, nice. So let me tell you a little bit about Nashville. Nashville is a city of just over 600,000 people, according to the 2010 census. It's uniquely situated, as indicated by 3 of its nicknames, only 2 of which, or only 1 of which, actually, you will know. The first of its nicknames is the Athens of the South. I don't know who conferred that nickname on Nashville, probably the Chamber of Commerce or something, but it's the home to 18 universities and 100,000 college students within an hour's drive of Nashville. And in this respect as well, it's a place that's actively involved in the worship arts conversation. At Vanderbilt, we have Robin Jensen, who is a speaker here, and who has written books that are included in the series that the Worship Institute produces. Trevecca Nazarene University has a Center for Worship Arts. David Lipscomb University has a worship ministry major. Belmont University, where I teach, has a religion and arts major. And this is extraordinary. Think about this for a second. There are about 7,000 students at Belmont. In 2010, 34% of our graduates were majoring in music business or music. Okay? So more than 1 in every 3 students is studying for music. It's a place also, Belmont is a place that's produced people like Tricia Yearwood, Leanne Womack, Brad Paisley, Josh Turner, Stephen Curtis Chapman, and so on. Nashville is also sometimes referred to as the buckle of the Bible Belt. Nashville has over 700 churches, which if you think about that, I expect that's nearly 20% of the number of churches in Grand Rapids or something like that. So it's really, getting up there. It's the location of the denominational headquarters of the Southern Baptist Convention, the National Baptist Convention, which is the largest predominantly African-American Christian denomination, is also home to the central offices of the United Methodist Church. Several Christian publishing companies are located there, including Thomas Nelson. But most notably, Nashville is known as Music City. So it's known for probably the images at the top and on the left there, the Grand Ole Opry, traditional country and western music. It's more recently become a place for a lot of pop and rock hipsters like Jack White, who is there on the front cover of the Nashville Scene, who has relocated to Nashville. Nashville is also home to Sheryl Crow, sometimes home to Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, I don't know, others I should mention, Kings of Leon in that pantheon. So over the last 4 decades, Nashville has been the second biggest music production center after New York. A Belmont study in 2006 estimated that it had an economic impact of $6.4 billion and contributed 54,000 jobs to the Nashville area. So again, think about a town of about 600,000, and about 1 in 10 people are in some way or another connected to the music industry. It's really an extraordinary place with an extraordinary concentration of creative people involved particularly in the music industry. A couple of further indications of this. This is from last year in Billboard. Rolling Stone named it 2011's best music scene. More musicians and music industry types live here than in any other city in the country except Los Angeles and New York. There are more than 80 record labels, 100 live music venues, 130 music publishers, and 180 recording studios. This was a great quotation from this little article. When country music star Tim McGraw brings his buddies from LA and New York to town, he always gets the same reaction. Everybody they hear they think is a star. That's my best Tim McGraw impersonation. McGraw said, "You can go down to the corner and listen to a guy who is the best singer you've ever heard. And you can't believe he's standing there with his case open on the corner." Which is extraordinary, again. I mean, I went to a really good music school as an undergraduate. But in Nashville, I've encountered the greatest concentration of talented musicians that I've ever met. So let me tell you a little bit about how this conversation today started for me. Part of the genesis of this conversation were discussions that I was part of at the Worship Institute or overheard at last year's worship symposium. I would often talk with people at this event or at the Worship Institute, and they would reflect that, at the Worship Institute, we're working hard at shaping worship, educating, informing, enriching the church's worship, but it seems like the people who really are shaping the worship are the people in the industry. Yeah. Hillsong, Passion, the publishing companies, CCLI, the record labels, the artists. Yeah. So, and sometimes that was just an acknowledgement, sometimes that was a lament. And I had a couple of responses to that as I participated in these conversations. One response was, as I listened to people, I would think, I'm not sure what you're describing is actually how the industry works. People would say, I wish that the record labels would do this and change that, or that artists would pay attention to this instead of that. And I would think, I'm not a music industry insider, so these guys can tell us in a minute whether or not this is the case, but I often thought, those are good concerns, and those are good ideas, and those are good criticisms that you've raised, but they might be sharpened or better focused with a clearer understanding of how the recording industry actually works, how the publishing industry actually works, what's going on in the lives of artists who are producing this music. The second response that I had hearing those conversations is, I don't hear you describing the people that I actually know in Nashville. So I often thought, if you are concerned about some of the things that you've mentioned, if you're concerned about worship that represents a greater diversity of the world's peoples, if you're concerned about worship that addresses issues of social justice, if you're concerned about worship with greater theological depth, I'd really like you to meet guys like Brad and John, who are friends of mine from church, because these are people of real substance, and a lot of the other people that I know who are involved in the industry, I think they share those concerns. And so wouldn't it be good if we could have a conversation together about how we might identify and move forward toward some of those concerns that we share? Yeah? One last note. Well, I have some pictures here, but I'll maybe just skim through this very quickly. As I talked with John about that, John asked me if I would conduct some interviews with people who are variously involved in the Christian music industry. And I chose 5 people to start with because they are people who are involved in different dimensions of the Christian music worship world. So my pastors are Jim and Kim Thomas, and they're significant because they're pastors. They're significant also because they are pastors to a church that is a huge number of musicians in it, and also because they, before they were pastors of this church, were recording artists. They were with this band called Say So, and there's one of their CDs there. Oh, look, and there's me on piano in our church. I circled me. Second person I interviewed is Daryl Harris, who again is somebody who comes at this conversation from various angles. Daryl is a kind of foundational figure in the world of contemporary music, Christian music. He started Star Song Records in the 1970s, but he's also now involved in the world of the church and the academy as the dean of the chapel at the Robert Weber Institute for Worship Studies. I interviewed Ginny Owens, who is a Dove Award-winning songwriter, recording artist. She's also a worship leader in her local church. She's also adjunct songwriting faculty at Belmont University. So again, you can see with each of these how these worlds of kind of the academy and the life of the church and the industry itself kind of overlap. And then Brad, I think it's worth mentioning with respect to Brad that not only is Brad involved in the industry, he's a musician. You have a master's degree in jazz pedagogy from Miami University. Yeah. Worked as a producer, as a performing musician. His wife, Erin O'Donnell, is a recording artist. And Brad continues to play in the worship band at our church. And John, who again is not only interested in the industry side, but has been a pastor for 20 years, is also a recording artist, as he mentioned. Here's spiritual songs on the recent recordings from his band, The Wayside. So people who are coming to this conversation from various points of view. So those are some of the participants in the conversation, how the conversation started. This is a particularly opportune time for us to pick up the conversation, and I'll just mention two things here. First of all, this is a time of, I think, cynicism or discouragement in the music industry. There was an extraordinary growth of CCM in the 80s and 90s. And in the early 90s, CCM was the fastest growing segment of the music industry. Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith both had top 10 albums. By 2008, the music industry's, or the CCM industry's flagship magazine, CCM Magazine, had shut its doors. So here's an article. The money is just drying up, says John Still, president of the Gospel Music Association. And then some industry veteran, John Thompson, weighs in. The last 4 years, the sky has fallen. Is that right, John? Industry is not what it was and will never be what it was. This is from 2009. And then just a few months later, after they interviewed John Still steps down as they announce major cutbacks in the Gospel Music Association. So there's this sense that, well, we had this shining moment in the 90s, and now kind of the bottom has fallen out. Yeah? That's true not only of the Christian music industry, that's true of the music industry generally. So here is a graphic from Business Insider in 2011, the real death of the music industry. Just a couple of things to note here. The music industry is down 64% from its peak. In real dollars, the music industry is actually down 45% where it was in 1973. So if you look over here, you can see in 1973, adjusted dollars, per capita expenditure on music was $47. In 2009, it's $26. Okay? So iTunes, Spotify, Napster, all this kind of stuff has had a huge impact on the music industry. So it's a time of discouragement, cynicism. It also means that it's a time of great openness. This is a moment of real opportunity. And again, John and Brad can speak to this much more eloquently. But I think everybody acknowledges we need to find some new ways of making this work. We need to find new ways of sharing music across the church. We need to find new ways of ensuring that people who write music for the church are fairly compensated for their music, and so forth. So what are those new ways? And there are a lot of things that are being tried, and a lot of new ventures and new partnerships that are being floated out there. So it's an ideal time for us to have this kind of conversation and say, all right, what's the way forward? Not just for the financial health of the music industry by any means, but for the good of the church and for the advancement of God's kingdom.
Please join me in thanking Steve. And I'm going to invite Steve along with Brad and John, if you'd actually come forward, and we're going to focus a bit more on life in Nashville and hear some of the stories behind the scenes. One of the major strategic trajectories for Worship Institute work over the next 5 years is to try to strengthen networks of learning and encouragement, really across the spectrum of Christian worship. And so this is a beautiful part. Steve mentioned interviews that he's done, and starting perhaps as soon as next month, those will begin appearing on our website. And one of the things we want to do is, through the website, to recreate a little bit of what we're going to experience now, to hear the stories of people who play an integral role in shaping the worship life of American congregations, to see the world from their perspective, how much we have to learn, and how much we can encourage each other. So, Brad, John, thanks so much for being here. It's great to hear. So I'm wondering if we could start by having you each tell your own story. Briefly, how did you get into the position you're in? And sort of what's the passion that you wake up with every day? Brad, would you start?
First, sure. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and I entered high school with my kind of out-of-school activities kind of being the nerd trifecta. I was on the golf team and the debate team, and there was
Careful now.
Yeah. There was a band that formed in my neighborhood, and they were absent a bass player, so I thought, I'm going to give this a swing. So I got an electric bass for Christmas when I was 14 years old, and instantly found out it was an infinitely better way to start conversations with the girls in my school than talking about my nerd tractor that I carried around to debate tournaments. And that was the beginning of really falling in love with music and with jazz. And so as a 14-year-old, I was really fortunate to have a really good bass teacher, and I was able to start playing in jazz clubs by the time I'd only played for 6 months, and I just found my life's passion. I got very serious about it very quickly, and so I was fortunate to get a scholarship to the University of Miami to study studio music and jazz there, and that was kind of my career plan, which my parents were thrilled about, was I was going to be a jazz bass player, very practical career. And once I found out you could get a degree in it, I was sold. I was fortunate while I was at school to meet Erin, who's my wife now, and I wrote some songs, and we had no intention of becoming artists, but she sang those songs, and it attracted the attention of a small independent record company in Nashville. And like a lot of musicians, we kind of figured our life would end up in New York, LA, or Nashville, as Steve mentioned a minute ago. So we moved to Nashville in January of '96. It started the tough career of building an artist career. And I found out very quickly I loved the behind-the-scenes stuff, and I loved the studio, and I really didn't like the travel. I liked the 30 minutes on stage every night, but the other 23 and a half hours of preparation for that I really wasn't well suited for. So my wife fired me from our band, and that enabled me to stay at home and write songs and produce. And when you write songs and produce, the people you interact with are A&R people. And I truly didn't even know what that stood for, but thankfully had a mentor in my life who, in the fall of '99, said, have you ever considered that maybe your gifts make more sense in A&R than even they do in writing and production? And to the point Steve made a minute ago, Nashville, because there's so much immense talent, really quickly helps you identify where there's a lot more in certain categories than where you are. And I was figuring out I was a good writer and I was a good producer, but I didn't know if I had the level of the people that I worked with often. So I decided to give it a swing, and that was 13 years ago. And I love my job. I think one of the things I love about it is it enables me. When you write songs, you go really deep with an artist for a day. And when you produce records, you might go really deep with an artist for 6 weeks. But when you A&R them, Many of the artists on my roster I've worked with for 10 plus years at this point. You're involved in the arc of their career, and you're involved even in their lives and their families, and you watch them go from 17, 18 years old when they come to the label to where they have wives and kids, and you hear songs that they've written in their bedroom, and then you hear that those songs are impacting the church in China and Africa, around the world. So that is the best part of what I get to do, and there's definitely a administrative and business component to my job, but getting to be in the creative arm of the company, I get to spend, I would say, roughly half my day each day, half my week, interacting with artists, listening to their songs, talking with them about the music that they make. So that's what I do.
How many songs are on your iPod?
Jeez, you know what? I've switched to Spotify. Yeah.
Spotify.
So I guess everything is.
Is that right?
Yeah.
How many songs do you listen to in a week?
Professionally or personally?
Yeah. Well, each.
Well, it's funny because that professional, I remember Charlie Peacock was a real hero of mine. And I remember seeing an interview with him years ago where he said, I don't have time to listen personally anymore. And I remember thinking that was so sad, but I definitely feel that tension the more time that goes by. It's just difficult. So I don't know, 150, 200 professional songs a week, and hopefully I can squeeze a couple albums in there just for pleasure.
All right. And help us, A&R stands for?
Artist and Repertoire.
Artist and Repertoire. Very good. So can you say just a little bit of what a typical day looks like, and then we'll switch to John.
Yeah. Well, that's what's great about the job is it's perfect for somebody with ADD because there really is no typical day. It's one day you really will be in the studio all day long, listening to songs, evaluating them for a record. Right now, for example, we're finishing up, the Passion Conference happened January 1 through 4 in Atlanta this year. And so the next week will be full of listening to all the songs on that record, 8, 9, 10 times each, making changes to the songs, getting them in the right sequence, working on the transitions. But then the week after that, it might be meeting with prospective new artists for the label. It's completely different. There are budget meetings interspersed in there, and there are other things that go on, but it truly is completely different.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
John?
So my story first?
Yeah.
So it's interesting your three-headed monster analogy of the contemporary music.
I didn't say monster now.
Well, maybe I will. I would be that monster, I guess, because my mom grew up Episcopalian and then really connected with her faith through the Jesus movement era of a women's charismatic Bible study. So I grew up with both all of the early Jesus music playing in the house, stuff like Larry Norman and Love Song and Randy Stonehill and Second Chapter of Acts, that my mom was passionate about. But I also grew up in the Anglican church, and so I feel like I kind of had this unique balance of liturgy and experience of content. And Dr. Weber spoke at my youth group when I was in high school because he went to our church in Glen Ellen, Illinois. There was just, opportunities that I now look back on and say, wow, there was a lot of struggles too. I had a fairly difficult life, and when I was a kid, just very volatile and moved around a lot. My biological father was a criminal, so we were kind of in hiding most of the time. But when I was 9 years old, my grandmother was getting concerned. My mom was getting concerned. I was latching on to music that felt more real to me. My mom's Christian music, I respected and I admired the faith that it gave her, but it sounded like it came from another planet on which everything was perfect, and it didn't relate to what I was feeling. At 9 years old, I discovered the Talking Heads and a record that had a song called Psycho Killer on it. That made a lot of sense to me, even though half the lyrics were in French and I didn't know what they meant. The energy of it made a lot of sense to me. The Clash made a lot of sense to me. Bob Dylan made a lot of sense to me. I didn't have a lot of friends, so I kind of had weird tastes that weren't defined by a social group. But my grandma and my mom were concerned about the music I was listening to. So my grandmother went to a Christian bookstore, this would be 1979 or so, and said, my grandson is listening to, and she had to have it on a piece of paper because grandma couldn't bring herself to probably say some of these things. Bands like, The Doors and the Talking Heads and the Sex Pistols, and do you have any Christian music that sounds like this? And the answer every Christian bookstore person said was, yes, we do, which, of course, in 1979 they did not really, but they sold her a tape by a band called DeGarmo and Key, and the album was called Straight On. Anybody
have that upstairs in the
Anybody have the DeGarmo and Key? This is their second album. my grandma made the mistake of telling me that it was Christian music, so I kind of filed it in my brain in that, oh, someday I'll grow up and I'll like this, but for now, I'm going to listen to the radio. And then we had to go into hiding. My mom had to take my brothers and I into hiding and go live at a Christian camp. And I lost kind of everything I had except that tape and a tape deck, and I finally listened to it, and it really, really saved my life. I mean, it was Christian, it was hopeful, but it was not rosy Pollyanna. It wasn't over my head theology. It was songs like Living on the Edge of Dying and Jericho and Long Distance Runner, and it was good biblical truth, but it was in an intense way that it melted what was becoming a very hard heart in my chest. And I got very excited about that. Now, I've built this kind of career. Most of my life I've been kind of the outsider because I've liked the Christian music that the church usually didn't like. So it was stuff like Resurrection Band from Chicago, which was a group that came out of an intentional community that's still thriving of over 500 people who share everything they own and minister in the inner city of Chicago. And they had a rock band that went out and preached the gospel and played rock and roll. A band from California called the 77s that was signed to a major label, but they were from a church. And so I started a thing when I was a teenager called True Tunes that was a Christian music store and magazine and concert venue, and I kind of lived in that blurry area where you couldn't tell if it was Christian music or just music being made by Christians. And I did that for quite a few years, then went and worked for the Cornerstone Festival for several years, it just had its final year this year, but for 28 years it was definitely the most progressive, left of center, culturally engaged faith and arts festival that I'd ever seen, and I was on staff there for a while. And then I wrote that book that I mentioned earlier called Raised by Wolves, which sort of studied the rock side of the Jesus movement continuum. And Eddie DeGarmo from DeGarmo and Key, who also, after he was kind of segueing out of DeGarmo and Key, they became one of the biggest bands in Christian music in the 80s. Then he started a record label called Forefront, signed a band called DC Talk, had a lot of success with them, signed a band called Audio Adrenaline, an artist named Rebecca St. James, and Forefront became very successful. He then sold that company to EMI and became a music publisher. Music publishers deal with songwriters and songs and copyrights. And then he built a publishing company and sold that company to EMI and then joined EMI to run their publishing company. So I really admired Eddie, not only because his band had been the first thing I had ever heard that had really gotten through to me, but because he really demonstrated this multi-tiered life where he was an artist, he was a business person, he had a great sense of humor. And so when he invited me to lunch, I said yes. And he had read my book, and he told me some fun stories that should have been in my book, but that I missed. And then he asked me about publishing and what I knew about publishing, and kind of recruited me to join the team there. So for just about 6 years, I've been working with EMI in the publishing department. And we work with songwriters. So we work with, I know I should have said this earlier, but like in this room, probably the biggest rock star we work with is Keith Getty. But we publish most of the big worship songs. And so we work with that, but we also had a #1 country song this year. We've had songs on the rock charts periodically. I do a lot of work with film and music supervision now, getting music put into films. If any of you saw a movie this Christmas called Christmas Angel on GMC, I was the music supervisor for that. Got to work with Brad on that because one of his artists, Mandisa, recorded one of the songs that one of our songwriters wrote specifically for the film, so it was a great teamwork kind of a opportunity and doing that. But I also, all along, have been a worship leader. I've been a small group leader. I pastored at a little inner city church in Chicago for 11 years called The Warehouse and worked with artists and stuff. So my wife and I we're an independent band. You know, what we do musically is very different than what is quote unquote commercially viable. But that, to me, the two are totally separated, you know, so. Yeah, and I'm just excited to speak into the process and encourage local music and independent music, and then also to help facilitate the work that people like Matt Redman do, because I think it's really important.
Well, you said you work with a lot of the biggest acts. When we spoke before, I think you said something like 41 of the top 50 songs on the CCLI chart of those, are songs that
we don't like to. The numbers are. Some of that is a function of corporate consolidation, but the numbers are, I think I think it's 23 of the top 25 and most of the top 50, most of the top 100. We either publish them or we administer the publishing on behalf of a partner. There's some public domain songs mixed in there, or the numbers would probably be a little bit higher, but that's really a function of the fact that whereas 10 years ago there was a lot of companies working totally separate from each other, because of a lot of the shrinkage in the industry, there's just been consolidation. The industry wouldn't support that many separate entities and that much overhead, so we now either publish or administer catalogs that 10 years ago were totally separated. So Hillsong, Integrity Music, we just absorbed Brentwood Benson's. They were the largest catalog of worship songs. They go back 100 years. That's now part of our catalog. So I don't want to, it can be misunderstood, I think, when people hear how many songs we represent, but that's really because we've got lots of partners that we work with under the umbrella.
So both of you in your bios have EMI, but do you ever
Just
see
going away now.
do you ever see each other, or how big? Give us a little picture of how many people are involved when we hear EMI.
At the EMI Christian Music Group, the division that John and I work for?
Yeah.
Is it 125 now?
Might be. Well, we just brought in a bunch of people because of the Brentwood thing. So
125 to 150 are in the building in Brentwood, Tennessee, where we work.
Okay, so 125, right? So this would be probably 4 times bigger than the faculty at Calvin Seminary are just in that group at EMI, right? That would be a way to picture the size of the operation.
But that's small. I mean, that's significant. I came in as the company had already shrunk. So I remember coming to meet Brad before I worked at EMI, and I couldn't find a parking space. I'd have to park in the lot next door. You don't have a hard time finding a parking space anymore. So as big as it might seem to you, what do you think? Is it
probably was near 300 at its
that's
peak. I think Steve's numbers said the industry shrunk about 64%, and our staff has probably roughly reflected that.
Okay. So we're entering a world here that's so important for us to learn. I'm thrilled. What I'd like to do is suggest that maybe, Steve, you could speak to this first, and then we can kind of go down the road. So we start telling the story of Nashville, Christian music, and its contemporary music becomes the term. But then all of a sudden, the worship song becomes a significant part of it. All right? So there's the worship side. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on what that means. And when you're talking, or in the grocery store in Nashville, when you start whistling the wrong tune, and pretty soon 75 people are singing harmony, right? I mean, that's how it works in the grocery stores in Nashville.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely.
What is the terms like the worship industry or the worship song? What is that phenomenon like? What do you think of, and how's that factored in your own stories? Maybe Steve, you want to speak into that a little bit first, then we can hear from Brad and John.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, and actually, I was going to make a little opening presentation at the start of our session after lunch, and one of the things I was going to talk about was just a kind of typology of the different ways that what people intend when they use the phrase contemporary worship. So when I ask students in my worship class, do you like contemporary worship, or are you practicing contemporary worship? They may answer yes or no, but they very often, I find, mean very different things. One may mean a particular musical style. One may mean a particular ecclesiology or approach to church. One may simply mean a kind of a designation of an era, just kind of a bland, this is something that is being produced now. So I don't think even in Nashville, or at least amongst my students, it may be different in the industry. I'd be interested in, there isn't a real tight sense of here's what contemporary worship means. If anything, I think being in Nashville has broadened my sense of what that term potentially can mean, because there are people there who are doing Christian music or who are doing music in the church, who are doing bluegrass, who are doing kind of stuff that's inspired by shape note singing, people who are doing stuff that's jazz inspired or black gospel inspired. So in a sense, I've gotten, my sense of the breadth of what that term can mean has expanded in Nashville.
Great. John, Brad, want to speak into that?
I think it's actually I'll take the opposite end of that answer
Oh,
and say
thanks a lot, man.
it's actually really simple. There's songs you sing in church on Sunday, and there's songs that you, if you like Christian music, you listen to on Christian radio. And sometimes they're the same thing, but often they're not. And really, when we're talking about it from a publishing perspective, we are listening to records. We're listening to the new Chris Tomlin record, the new Matt Redman record. And there's a group of us that'll sit in a room, and all of us are worship leaders at our own churches, and all of us have different backgrounds. And we will listen to the songs and picture in our mind and sing them quietly to ourselves. Can we imagine this song working on Sunday at church? And that's really the dividing line on our level. Now, there are churches that will do music on Sundays that are way outside the bounds of what the church next door would do on Sundays. That's totally different. But from the industry perspective, it's also important to realize that the Christian music, the contemporary Christian music world, is really statistically what I've seen anywhere from 5 to 10% of actively engaged Christians are regular consumers of contemporary Christian music. If you talk about the whole body of Christ, all denominations, all ages, a study that came out 20 years ago had it at about 9%, and that was they were talking about how that had grown. So most active Christians aren't really listening to Christian radio, going to Christian bookstores, buying Christian music. Now that's partly because a lot of people stop listening to new music by the time they're about 24. They like the music that they liked when they were kids for the rest of their life. That's just sociology and anthropology. So you can kick against those bricks all you want, but there's very few people that adjust to new music styles as they age. So a small chunk of the church is engaged with contemporary Christian music, but it's enough of a chunk that it's built an industry. And there are moments when when someone like Amy Grant or Michael W. Smith engages a larger percentage of those Christians. Butterfly Kisses, a song like that, engages a lot more of those Christians. There's those breakthrough moments, but on an ongoing basis, it's a smaller number. However, there's a much larger number of Christians who are engaged with contemporary worship music on a weekly basis, because most denominations at least work some of the songs into they either have an alternate service or they have it as part of their traditional service. So it's a much higher percentage of the body of Christ knows worship songs. I would say that there's more people that know the song, How Great Is Our God, than really could list 3 Chris Tomlin album titles. That song is much more popular. And Chris would admit that. I mean, his songs are bigger than him. In Christ Alone. How many millions of Christians know that song? They don't know who Stuart Townend is. They don't know who Keith Getty is. It's not an artist-driven song. It's a song that the church really drove. So to us, that's really a simple divider. Is it a song sung in church or not? And individual churches can move that needle however they choose to, but by and large, our job is to kind of just offer up the salad bar. We put it out there, and then the churches take the music that they're most excited about, and it tends to be stuff that is easy to sing, that it's easy to learn, that has that mystical, mysterious combination of it's innovative and it's somehow fresh and new. It doesn't sound like everything else, but it yet sounds familiar and comfortable to us, and that defines what's done on Sunday mornings, and everything else is part of the contemporary Christian music world, radio-driven.
I think that's fair. I do see what Steve is talking about as well. To me, the term worship is a little bit like the musical term alternative that we had in the 90s. I mean, when it first emerged, it meant something, and then the more and more alternative bands there were, the harder it was to pin down exactly what that meant. Because I think John is correct in kind of the macro, but in the smaller picture, I do think there's a generation of younger worship leaders, which I think John touched on in his point a minute ago about youth culture. And that they see a lot of their musical heroes, if you've ever heard of bands like Sigur Rós or what's happening right now with Mumford & Sons. And so that youth culture says, well, wait a minute, should worship just be songs that we can sing on Sunday morning? Or does it provide a certain kind of experience or context in which to experiencing God? So in terms of the young worship leaders that are coming into the label now, they've got a different musical palette. I think they would not feel as strongly like it has to be a sing-along song that can travel all over the world. Where John's saying, a lot of older, more established worship leaders, that's a really important value to them. I want people to hear my song and be able to use it quickly, I want it to be accessible and have a melody that's easy to grab onto. I think there's a generation of worship leaders that they don't feel that way. They feel differently.
I've even seen, like, John Mark McMillan is an alternative worship artist who has had one song that the wider churches embrace, but I saw him at a concert in California in a bar, and I was standing up against the bar because I'm the tallest guy in the room, so I got to always go to the back. And he couldn't sing. His voice was out. He'd literally blown he had no voice. The crowd there knew his songs so much, and he went out and whispered into the microphone and said, "I'm sorry, I'm really sick. I can't sing, so why don't you guys be the singer tonight?" And so the band played, and he kind of led this bar full of people in a night of about an hour of just passionate worship, only one song of which I had really ever heard done congregationally, that How He Loves song. The bartender leans over and bangs my arm. He's like, "What is going on?" Like, he's never seen this happen before. So that there's personally worshipful songs, and there's people that listen to music and it's worshipful for them on a personal level. And I think that's absolutely right. And there always has been that, and I hope always will be. But when we're talking about the genre, when we talk about contemporary worship music, we're not usually including the more progressive side of that until the church catches up, and someday those songs are going to be done on Sunday mornings.
Let's focus now on worship songs that would be cherished by congregations, and sort of focus on that. And I was talking with a pastor a couple weeks ago who said, "Wow, what changes have happened in the contemporary worship world. The songs, if I think back 25, 30 years, the songs are richer, deeper, better suited to congregational singing." His way of telling the story was as a story of coming toward maturity. What do you think of that particular way of telling the story? Is that get at it? Is he right? From a pastoral point of view, is that something you see and feel? How would you react to that sense? Or if you don't want to quite bite on that, what changes have you seen on the worship side over the last 20 years or so?
I mean, that's an encouraging assessment, and I hope a fair one. I think one of the things that I've seen, this is a big generalization, but there was a time when the artists that would come in who wanted to make worship music, and their intentions were good, but they weren't necessarily a worship pastor at a church. They weren't attached to a local body, and it was funny because even from a business standpoint, we had trouble making that stuff work. And then with the Passion Movement, with Hillsong, it's interesting if you look at their forum, typically there are a number of pastors and speakers attached to it, actively speaking in to the music. All of these artists, I remember it was a huge deal. Now it's kind of funny, but Chris Tomlin can't play shows on Saturday nights because he has to be home to lead worship on Sunday morning. And that doesn't sound that radical now, but that was a big deal because in the 90s, most of the people who were Christian artists were entertainers, and that was their job. There was always a Saturday night show. So you'd get home Sunday afternoon. My wife and I did that in the 90s. It was just part of what you did. So when guys like Chris came along and said, "No, I'm attached to this church first and foremost. I'm attached to this music first and foremost. My pastor's a co-writer on a lot of my songs. I don't lead." That's my hope, is that has infiltrated the music, and part of it's hopefully it being more rich and being more effective is that you're seeing the results of kind of that commitment to a local body and the involvement of some pastoral guidance in the writing of the songs.
I just got done writing 100, actually I think 102 because I lost count. It was a very confusing project. Song devotionals based on popular worship songs over the last 30 years for a new NIV Worship Together Bible that's going to come out next fall. So I spent all fall listening to and looking at the history behind a lot of these songs, talking to many of the songwriters, finding quotes, so that in this Bible you'll have these devotionals. If you chose to interact with these devotionals, they'll have the scriptures behind these songs, they'll have the story behind the songs, they'll have the lyrics that you can contemplate, and they'll be placed throughout near where the scriptures are that inspired them. I'll tell you, when somebody challenges me on that, I like to ask for details, because I think people have very selective memories when it comes to the music that they're talking about from 20 or 30 years ago having more depth. Because I guarantee you, I can go back and find some of the most vapid, silly worship songs in any decade. I've had to listen to all of them. And we tend to remember the stuff we loved and forget the stuff that was silly. And now, because again, there's this phenomenon of sort of creative calcification that happens where we tend to like the stuff we liked at a certain point in our life. And we're not interested in digging and finding the stuff that's available today, the new worship music being done today that is theologically rich, that is challenging, that is socially engaged, because we're old and we just don't care about it. We don't want to go on websites and listen to streams, and we don't want to engage with the technology the way it is now. We want someone to hand us a cassette so we can put it in our truck and listen to it the way we did 30 years ago. I'm sorry, but that's just kind of these are the answers I give to people because...
You're so cynical, John.
I just think that people tend to remember the bad. They remember what they liked and they just don't. They can't tell me the lyrics to 10 or 20 current songs. Tell me that 10,000 Reasons by Matt Redman, which was a radio hit, is becoming a church hit. Tell me that song isn't biblically anchored, isn't theologically true. Somebody break that down for me and show me how they got that wrong. But they're not thinking of that song. They're thinking of, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yeah. And they don't realize that song came out 20 years ago, so, yeah, I think that people just don't really necessarily know the whole picture, either what was going on then or what's going on now.
10,000 Reasons actually going to be in the new RCA hymnal. How's that?
Well, there you go.
How's that for reception? Yeah.
And that's a big old stinking Christian music hit.
Yeah, there you go.
I think one thing that I think is notable in terms of that development is there have been a number of flagship artists or songwriters who have really publicly identified themselves strongly with theologians or with Bible teachers. So I think of when I was living in the UK, and I remember Matt Redman reaching out to Jeremy Begbie, and also Robin Perry, who's a British theologian and author, and saying, sit down with me, I want to learn, I want to know more. And he has also written and reflected theologically. You have Chris Tomlin partnering with Louis Giglio and John Piper often speaking at the Passion conferences. And certainly Keith Getty, another instance. Keith Getty goes to our church as well and lives just down the street from Belmont. And he'll phone me up sometimes, say, Steve, can you come down for lunch? I'm working on a song, I need something theologically profound. Yes, give me something, I'm reflecting on this, can you tell me something about, but I think there's a guy who's really actively seeking out theological teaching and reflection and wisdom, and those are, as I say, kind of flagship people. I think that's filtered down. Oh, one other thing, Daryl Harris, that I mentioned before, said, one of the extraordinary things that's happened in the past decade is that he called N.T. Wright, the great New Testament theologian. He said, N.T. Wright has become pretty much Vineyard Music's in-house theologian. He said those guys with the Vineyard bring N.T. Wright in all the time. They have all of their songwriters reading that stuff, reflecting on it, discussing it. So there have, I think, been some signal instances of that kind of thing, which has been salutary for the
Wouldn't that be
generally.
fascinating to sit at that table for the discussion? It's
Yeah.
absolutely fabulous. All right, so now I'm thinking of another conversation where a young pastor and a young songwriter were talking. Passionate contemporary worship at their church, and the conversation went like this. We have so many songs about praising God. We need more songs, to your point earlier, John, about lament and confession. We have so many songs about my personal relationship with Jesus. We need more songs about the church as a body, the kind of resistance to individuality and a sense of the whole. And then I think there was one other point. We have a lot of songs that focus on Thanksgiving, but almost none in that world that focus on things like the Lord's Supper or baptism. It's not really what they were doing. Chuck Fromm just wrote about this in Worship Leader magazine, is they were actually thinking about a congregation's curated collection of songs. What does the balanced diet look like for a church? Hymnal editors worry a lot about this. How do you have a balance that covers the whole spectrum of themes? And from their congregation, their struggle was, how do we achieve that balance? My guess is that at EMI, you don't wake up thinking, wow, how can we feed the balanced curation of a song collection in individual church? But any thoughts about how to think about that balanced diet of songs in the life of the church? And what advice would you give to the songwriter, young songwriter, who's actually working at cranking out stuff to fill in the gaps? Mm-hmm. And let's assume for a minute this songwriter is actually exceedingly talented. So let's assume it's a real A-list possibility. What advice would you give to a church and to a songwriter that is wanting to fill in the gaps? Your response to that broad cluster?
I mean, I think you've hit on one of the main tension points of what we do, which is we work for a public company. That is its stated goal is to produce a profit and sell music. And this is going to shock you guys, but movies with happy endings are more well attended than movies with sad endings. And that's true of Christians as well. Like songs that are encouraging, positive, and uplifting, you see it in CCLI, you see it in radio testing, they sell better. So there's an incentive for a public company to produce more music like that, and it definitely happens, and it's a very real tension. I suppose my own personal viewpoint is that, and what I would say to this artist is that it's like, if you took away from lyrics and maybe based instead on music, I grew up like a huge Police and Sting fan. And, Sting would often talk about the fact that most music that did well on the radio was in 4/4 time. And he wanted to write in common time because he knew he had a greater chance of success. But he had this phrase that I always loved. He said, I feel like it's my job to put a vitamin inside of the Twinkie. I know the public wants Twinkies, but I think they need their vitamins. So he would.
That's going to be tweeted out now by 400 people, actually.
Make sure Sting is credited.
That's good.
Not me, but he. I love that idea of, and I think what he was hitting on was because he had a richer musical vocabulary, I think it made him a more interesting artist and extended his career. He couldn't change, like John was saying a minute ago, the fundamental truths of what people respond to. But I do think we have a responsibility. I think it's cool that he saw himself that way as an artist. Like, I don't want to make just palatable music that gets played on the radio. I want to do something more important than that. And that's been my experience with the Matt Redmans, with the David Crowders, that those guys think deeply about it. They wrestle with the tension of, I know my audience would really prefer this. I know I'll probably sell more records and get more airplay if I do this. I'm going to do some of that, but I've got to find a way to weave in some of these other important themes.
Steve and I talked about this when he interviewed me for this thing, and we get a little bit of a different perspective from publishing because, again, our job is to offer up the songs to the church. And if you go to worship together and you become a member, then every week you get a newsletter that gives you free music. It's monetized in a totally different way through CCLI. So it's just free. Here's the salad bar. Take what you want. We even have chord charts, which is all you really need for most of these songs, for free. You can just look up the song on our site. We have them indexed by scripture. We have them indexed by theme. You want to look up communion. We've offered up some fantastic communion songs. One, Christ is Risen by Matt Maher. Unbelievable song. I love that song. There are people who love that song, but it's not as popular as the other songs. So if we're putting all these songs out there and most people are always going to the pudding, then we have to keep putting more pudding out on the salad bar, right? And I mean that has a negative connotation because I don't believe that the other songs are just pudding. Pudding is good. But, tomatoes, whatever. But the point is we can offer it up, and the fact is the church, there are individuals who will say, why don't we have more of this? And I said, well, did you hear this song? Did you hear this song? Did you? No. Well, we can't show up at their house and make them listen to the stuff. That's what I mean by engaging in technology in the way that the tools that we have. So it takes some investment of time to actually research these songs and not just do the ones that you hear on the radio or that other churches are already doing. But that's kind of how the bulk of the church community goes. They go with the songs that are already popular. A lot of times it's because these big movements like Passion, they've got 40,000 college students together. They can introduce a new song, and then those 40,000 college students go home and say, we're going to be doing this song. And that drives demand. But there are good songs of lament, and there are lots of these songs, but you have to dig a little bit to find them. It's like when I was a kid and you look at the hymnal, I had some choral vocal training, so I could tell what the melody was from looking at the sheet music. Most people couldn't. How can you engage a hymnal if you're not a trained musician? It's just black stuff on a white page. It doesn't make any sense to you. You got to hear it. You got to sing along with the congregation until you're up to speed. Well, these days with this kind of music, it's audio. It's listening to the songs on a website, looking at the lyrics, and then trying them. And some churches, it takes a few times. You have to do a song a few times before people feel like they get it. There's a song called Unwavering by Matt Maher that I did at our church. And our church is fairly progressive in terms of engaging new music, more than most. But still, it took 3 or 4 times of me doing it. None of the other worship teams really knew it. And then Steve said, I want to do that Unwavering song. And it was like, oh, it's spread. And now it's not just that one that the Thompsons do. It's people become familiar with it.
So I think one of the keys is to have me introduce things. In terms of
There you go, actually. I like it. So last question, and then we're going to shift gears in the room here. How many people in this room have some responsibility for choosing songs for worship in your worshiping community? So this is a crucial role. So now you have the chance to give the pastoral discipleship charge to all these people who are stewards of song diets for congregations. What would you say? What advice would you have for us as choosers? And because the company you work for is a public company, that's really close to being a consumer. A chooser, consumer, are different words, but really, the choices we make are both about pastoral leadership in a congregation, but they also have a role in this industry ecology. Any thoughts, advice that you'd want to give, any of you, those of us who are song choosers, about how to do that role faithfully as a disciple?
I don't know how helpful this is. Just one thing that struck me from our interview, Brad, you're talking about the website Worship Together, and you had some extraordinary numbers about how many people are on it every week. This huge number, over 100,000. You said, another thing that's interesting is you can see when people go on there. And he said, he said it's remarkable. I don't know.
This is a trade
you can correct this. 80% of them are downloaded Saturday night.
Truth be told, we had a gathering of 25 leaders of major preaching initiatives gather here at Calvin yesterday, all of whom run preaching-related websites. Guess when the preachers are online?
Yeah.
The very same time. Web use spikes on Saturday evening. Yeah, that's right. So it's a common thing, right?
And so maybe, I don't if that's very helpful or very profound, but it really does take deliberation and intention. And I also lead worship at our church. I've been in that spot. And you think, oh my goodness, I have to get something together now. And what do I go to? What can I pull off, right? And so some of it is being reflective before Saturday night and thinking about, how adequately are we addressing the range of the testimony of Scripture in our worship? And can I set out a curriculum for myself, for our church, for the next 6 months, for the next 3 months?
A lot like pastors making choices about sermon preaching and text over time, the discipline, awareness, responsiveness. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll give you some specific kind of tangible advice, all of you people that had your hands up. You got to listen to more music. I would challenge you, and if you don't have Spotify, you should get Spotify. You can either do it for free and listen to it on your computer for a limited amount of time, or you can pay a whopping $10 a month and listen to anything that's going on in the world anytime. You can stream it on your phone, you can listen in your car, and you can build your own playlist of new worship music, or you can subscribe to mine. Like I've got one that I've got 500 songs in already that's got all this new and up-and-coming worship stuff, and it's as new songs come on, I add them in there, and people who subscribe to that list can just listen to it like their radio station and become familiar with these songs, and you never know what might pop out. Take advantage of that kind of thing and make yourself more familiar with these songs, and realize you have to hear a song a few times before you really can decide whether it's good or not. Don't just listen to the verse, chorus, bridge, and say, this will never work at my church. challenge yourself. The other thing I would say is do a new song. I don't know how often how many people do a new song every week? At least one new song a week. Yeah. How many will do at least one new song a month? Okay. Well, maybe push that. Maybe every other week do a new song. I like to, every time we lead worship, which is only, we have so many teams at our church that we rotate. So we do it about once every 2 to 3 months. Every time we do it, I try to introduce a new song. That just gets the blood flow going, and people start getting used to the idea that it's okay in singing worship to have to learn a song. It's not the end of the world that you don't already know every song. So do more new songs, and then you spend time listening to those songs. I'm on there at just John J. Thompson, so if you go on Spotify, if you do this, you can search for me, and you can subscribe to any of my playlists, or you can tweet me or whatever, and I'll send you a direct link, and you can subscribe. And I just keep dragging songs in there, and you'll hear stuff that sounds like Pink Floyd, and you'll hear stuff that sounds like bluegrass music and yodeling, and you'll hear stuff that's in other languages, but it's all kind of new worship music. And that's what I listen to at my desk, when I'm working, just in the background, just always listening. So.
I'll just say ditto to what both these guys said, and to Steve's point, intentionality. I don't lead worship, so I'm speaking more as somebody who sits in the congregation now, but I know when I attend church and I feel a real weaving between what the message is and the songs that were chosen, it's a whole other layer of experience for me. And to these guys' point, the point Steve makes, I got to be honest, I don't often feel that, even at really good churches. It feels a little bit more like a mini concert right before the pastor speaks. And so when those things are part of the whole and seen that way rather than the kind of moment for the worship team to shine, I think it's a whole other experience.
But Brad is a mean worship bass player.
Oh, my goodness.
So you got to see lead worship bass. Lead worship bass right there.
All right, next year at this conference, I think we're going to have the band right here. What do you think?
Yeah.
We work on that, actually. That's going to be good.
It occurs to me that Daryl Harris addressed that issue as well in our interview. One thing that he was encouraged about is the growth among evangelicals of interest in the church calendar and in the common lectionary. And so Daryl said, I really see that as, as one of the keys to a way forward to, a balanced diet of texts in our worship music. That if we can introduce contemporary worship leaders to the lectionary and to the church calendar and walk them through the story of the church throughout the year and through scriptures throughout the year, then they'll choose songs that are appropriate to that cycle.
Great. There's also a bunch of hymns that tie in with contemporary songs. You can blend a traditional hymn right into a Matt Redman song or a Matt Maher song, or if you're intentional, you take the time to think about it and research, and and there's even these hymns now that are being kind of reimagined, and they're having new choruses added to them or bridges so that you've got a refrain. There's a whole bunch of that happening now, and that can be a great bridge for people in your congregation that just want to do the hymns. You can do the hymn and then have that chorus come along, and if they get freaked out, just give them a little history lesson on how many people speak into the evolution of a hymn. People get real precious about their hymns, and they don't realize that the one that they love was probably written by 4 different people over 200 years, because every generation would say, I'm going to actually take this into my day and age. So you can shut that down really quick, by just telling them the truth about where Amazing Grace came from, or some of those hymns.
Great. A little behind the scenes, actually, in the CRCRC hymnal, there are about 25 of those built right in, kind of brand new combination things that people will discover along the way, actually. Another story. I'd like to encourage everyone here to do something for the next 4 minutes, to stand up and find the person next to you and note one thing of the last part of this conversation that has encouraged you or surprised you, that gives you something to pray for in gratitude or for the trajectory of future discipleship. So this is the stand, be on task, talking, and I'm going to gather us up in 5 minutes, okay? Ready, set, go. We'll ask you to stay up front here. So stand on This is fabulous. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. I know exactly. Surfing. Yep. Okay, if I could ask everyone to be seated and we'll continue. Feel free to pour a glass of water for yourself. Now's a good time before the conversation continues. That's just fine. And what I'd like to do now is to provide, starting in just a couple minutes, with an opportunity for you to ask questions of our Nashville group, the questions that you've wanted to ask the worship industry reps, Nashville, that you've always wanted to ask. There are 2 microphones here, and what I'd like to ask you to do is to form a line. So I have a little sense of who has a question, and we'll just wait in line and try to get through as many of these, the questions that you have as possible in the next few minutes. While you're thinking about topics that you'd like to raise, what I'd like to do is actually put a couple of our other conference presenters a little on the spot and ask them to offer one or just a very brief comment of reflection on what we just experienced and the conversation we're having together. Any word of encouragement or something that surprised you? And I'm walking around here with a microphone trying to meet the eye of someone. Claudio, could I ask you to say a word?
When we were talking, one thing that was encouraging for me was to see that the cross-fertilization of sources and of possibilities, and this sources traveling around and changing churches, and one church changing because of what they received and sending something that they have done and then being sang there. I think this is very encouraging. I said that I tend to want to sing a Kyrie about is the control of the church by the industry. So the industry is what defines what the church is doing. And so I wonder that perhaps the local church is doing its own music and taking its own agency is a way of balancing what the industry is doing with what we can do.
Thank you so much. Carol, could I ask you to respond here?
I wanted to affirm that. I hear wonderfully theologically deep songs that are being written now more than 10, 15, 20 years ago. Maybe they were being written and I wasn't paying attention, and I'm paying attention now, so I'm finding them. So I affirm that. The other thing is that if the industry is driving what's coming, then what we buy is what's driving what's being produced. So if we purchase, if we listen to a rich spectrum of worship music, then that's Am I right? Then that's what will come. So the industry controls it, but we control the industry by our purchasing and by our practice. So it's back on us.
So we're going to end this afternoon by actually trying to identify the most theologically rich and deep worship song that is somewhere below number 200 on the list, all right? And if we all get together and scheme, we're going to see how high we can drive that. What do you think? Scott Sherman, do you have a word?
Well, on the spot. I'm encouraged to hear this idea that there's sort of a renewed passion around cultural engagement. And because this is not my primary musical language, I'm just, that really tweaks my curiosity. The theological thought I've been mulling on, because I lead the Newbigin House, I'm always thinking about Leslie Newbigin. And Newbigin, there's a little booklet where he talks about looking at, sometimes we fall into the ditch when it comes to not being able to hold Jesus and the kingdom together. We either get Jesus without the kingdom, or we get the kingdom without Jesus. And he says, when you get Jesus without the kingdom, you kind of get that me and God depersonalized, personalized eschatology that is totally disengaged from the world. And then in some of our more mainline circles, you often get the kingdom without Jesus, where it really is about our social agendas, and our worship can be beautiful and yet kind of cold. I'm really encouraged that there's, in all sorts of different cultural expressions, ways that Jesus and the kingdom may be being woven together more meaningfully.
Gerardo, can I put you on the spot here? Reaction, word of encouragement? Did I catch you at a good time here? Good.
Well, first, I think that it's encouraging to see that Calvin is interested in understanding contemporary Christian worship in a more expansive way. I do think that the conversation here is a little bit of, there's this weird outsider that has gone through the gates. What do we do with them? And how do we accommodate them? And should we provide a comfy chair, or should we make sure that they get cleaned up first? I mean, I think that there's a lot of conversation that's going on about contemporary Christian worship where people who really know this and feel at home with this would find this conversation really weird. And so there's an attempt to accommodate, understand, and embrace, although I think that it's an uncomfortable and prickly relationship as far as I can see at the moment.
If you want actually a converse experience of prickliness, there's a small theologians caucus at the annual worship leader conferences, and it has a little bit of the same feel. And I think what we're after is 5 years from now, can that not be the case? Can there be such synergy and understanding and sense of mutuality? That's a kind of group that goes and forms a support club, actually, and tries to hang on for the ride. And so I thank you for saying it, because it makes very clear the dream and passion and the fact that the conversations we're having today are, I cannot think of a more crucial conversation for the discipleship of the whole church in some ways than the one we're part of today. So thank you so much. All right, comments or questions that you have for our Nashville guests, come to the microphone, and if you'll line up, and we'll just go back and forth. We'll try to make them as brief as possible so we can get as many different voices in as possible.
Hi,
go right ahead.
Peter Slate from Ashland. I've got a question which I'd like to hear you reflect on that. I was struck by the image of you listening to the tracks and thinking, could we sing this in a congregation? For me, one of the big problems facing church musicians is that the resource that people go to for contemporary Christian music is solo vocal. But worship leaders are theoretically trying to think of songs for groups of people to sing. I understand commercially why that is, but most worship, now this doesn't apply to anyone in the room as a musician, but a lot of worship leaders are sort of doing karaoke. They're trying to reproduce what they hear on this disc. I think that's, I'll be provocative, I think that's crippling congregational singing. Could I hear your reflection on that?
I agree. I think that we have that challenge. Sometimes there's a great worship song nestled within a highly produced an entertaining track. And so what we sometimes do at Worship Together is we take that song and re-record a simple acoustic version of it so that people could imagine it. I know that when my wife and I lead worship, because we have two singers all the time, one of us is singing the melody, the other one is harmonizing, and on a great week, we bring one or two additional singers to harmonize, and we take time to develop three parts usually, sometimes a fourth part. These songs are very easy to do that with. I mean, they're very easy to do that with. I have just enough choral training and 20 years being in a band to be able to figure out that you can do that with a little bit of effort, and you can take 10,000 Reasons and turn it into a choral song without being a fancy choral arranger. So most of the songs that lend themselves to singing, this is frankly, what would make a good drinking song usually makes a good worship song. And I know that might be provocative to some of you, but it's the same. We're Western European descendants. We kind of got a certain musical vocabulary. We've got only a certain number. We're very stunted in terms of the number of notes that are on our palette. We're not like the folks in Korea, the folks in the Middle East who have all these quarter tones and interesting. We're really dumbed down to the notes we have, and we kind of have major, minor. We only have a few gears we can go into. So these songs lend themselves, I think, to being reinterpreted in all kinds of different ways. I've heard them done as black gospel songs, as bluegrass songs, as choral songs, as southern gospel songs. Like you can kind of do that with it, and that's the beauty of working with songs. Is to us, the particular recording of the song is great if it's a hit and it makes our songwriters some money. That's wonderful. But Worship Together, we're about just introducing the songs. Once it's out there, you do it however you like to do it. Don't be married to the version on the Passion record, for crying out loud, unless you've got a full rock band and that's your vocabulary and that's who you're reaching out to. But do it on a ukulele if you want to do it on a ukulele. Do it a cappella, Don't limit your imagination to how any one artist recorded it. Yeah, that's a good point.
Dean next.
I'm Dean Clatter. I'm from Bloomington, Illinois. I'm a pastor there. And I also was intrigued about this meeting where you're all sitting around listening to what's going on to figure out what to offer in the salad bar or the pudding bar. But what you shouldn't have said that.
I want to hereby edit that, and I want to strike that from the record and change pudding to tomatoes.
All right, tomatoes. There we go. That's good.
But can you tell us, because that seems like a phenomenal amount of power to be figuring out what to introduce to the world. Can you tell us just more about what that meeting looks like and what you're thinking and what's brought into that space?
First, I don't think it's really that much power, and I think maybe the way I described it sounded a little bit more ivory tower-ish than it is. We introduce over 100 songs a year. So there are all kinds of songs that group says, this one sounds like it would work for like a youth worship service, or this one sounds like it would work great for a communion or a special music song, or my wife and I have even been trying to write songs that would be good specifically for funerals, because there's a unique need there. We don't only put songs out on Worship Together that are that flavor. I'm just saying that those are the flavors that most people want, those few examples somebody gave. So we're putting the spinach out and the onions and the green peppers and everything else too. And every year, if you get the newsletter every week and you listen to the 1 or 2 or 3 songs, you're going to hear something throughout the year. The more we can tell, though, which songs people click and listen to. We can tell which ones they click the link and watch the little video of the songwriter talking about. We can tell how many people visit the song page and want the chords. And then we can see in the CCLI numbers which songs are actually being done. So there is more. We're going to follow the demand, but we're always outside of that. You're always going to find stuff that's different. It's just up to you to walk down that whole salad bar and pick and choose. And then there's going to be times where you're going to go off that bar and you're going to find it in other places too. But the burden is on the church, frankly. I guess that's my point. The burden is on the church. The burden is on the worship leaders. The burden is on the pastors to drive the demand, not on the corporations to tell the church what they should be singing. I don't think, honestly, we can't. If we could do that, if we could determine that this song would be a hit, then it would be a whole different model. But we don't. We just respond to what the church wants, so it's on the church. But all those options are out there.
Okay, great. Good, next.
Adam Perez, I'm worship leader at Trinity Christian College in Chicago. So I lead worship for college students, and this being about discipleship, the part that concerns me is I feel like we're ready to fully participate in like an American consumerist framework for music and for music for our worship, that we're ready to just say, let's use our purchasing power, which is, this is an important practical thing, but I don't know, is there another way? Is there, and maybe this isn't the best question for the two of you being industry people, but I don't know, is there some other way other than just like fully participating in the consumer thing?
I mean, I'll use an example I did a minute ago of how many, and really I think at this point all of the worship leaders that are on the label are tied to a local church, and so I think their answer to that would be, why do you have this song on your record that's a really sad song? It's like, well, I have it because I'm thinking of a specific example, a kid was killed in our congregation this year. He was killed by a gang member in a rough part of town, so I had to write a song about it. So my response would be that I think as long as we stay tied to people who are tied to a local community, and that's where their songs get birthed out of, it will ultimately reflect, are they conscious of what the market wants? Of course they are. That's where their paycheck comes from. But truly, most of them, and I would say virtually all of them, are mostly writing songs out of a sense of what does my community need to hear this year. And what we found is, ironically, that's what the rest of the church needs to hear. Those are the songs that spread far and wide. And do some songs get elevated over others because they have a more general application? For sure, but I think to John's point, I could sit with you and go over a lot of the records we've worked on and songs that maybe haven't gotten highlighted, but they're there. They're in there, and they're there because they've grown out of the experience of a local body.
And I'd like to say to that as well, I think that's an excellent concern to raise. I think that's an excellent question to raise. But to go back to my presentation, it's an opportune time to raise that question because it's not as if the music industry is thriving, the current model is thriving, right? So to a certain extent, you can tell me if this is right, but the industry as it exists to answer a couple of questions. One is, how do we get people who are writing songs, how do we get those songs out to churches? And then how do we properly remunerate people who have given their lives to writing songs for churches, okay? And we've got a model right now that kind of works, but also is maybe not working if it's declined 64% in however many years. So I think this is a good time to think about other models, other partnerships, other ways. But I think those two questions also are questions that still need to be answered. What are ways that gifted people within the church can make their songs available to others in the church? And what are ways, too, that the church can support those people so that they're able to exercise their gifts?
I think there's also maybe a possible misunderstanding. I appreciate her advice for everybody to go buy the music. That certainly reinforces that the CD sales, which is great. And CDs get listened to by many people, and so that's a great way for songs to spread. But that's not the primary vehicle that we're talking about when it comes to songs being done on Sundays. CCLI is what most churches have a small fee that they pay for the privilege of reproducing lyrics. Now, the thing about CCLI is all that money gets put into a big pile, and then a representative sample of the churches that rotates around. You all probably know this, at least all those people that put their hands up when we asked who chose songs. A representative sample reports for 6 months at a time, and then we extrapolate that sample out over that whole pot of money. And we say, okay, so here's all the dues that people paid, and this song was done this many times by the sample group, so we're going to extrapolate that out to the whole group, and we're going to say this slice of that revenue goes to the songwriter and publisher of that song. So obviously the most popular songs are going to get the bigger chunks of that, and that's going to go to those writers. But there's no wall keeping anybody out of that model. And that model doesn't require a sale of anything. That's why Worship Together just gives those songs away as much as we can. Because I said we get monetized on the back end from the CCLI thing. So strictly when you're talking about songs being done in church, one answer would be write your own song or dig deeper into that pile and find other songs that meet your needs, and do those songs and report them to CCLI when it's your turn. Do your work and fill out that paperwork. Don't just, fill out 6 songs that you think you did at some point. Do it truthfully. And that model can work. I do think that when I speak at colleges to worship leaders and songwriters, I also really try to challenge people to find some healing in your imagination, because I think our imaginations have been corrupted by definitions of success that are not biblical and that are not sustainable. And it's kind of like the lottery holding up the really, really big oversized check. You know in the rational part of your mind that check is not taken to the bank and deposited. That check is designed to appeal to your emotional side, not your rational side. The rational side is telling you there's no way I'm winning the lottery. It's a bad investment of my money. They don't want you to think about it. They want you to emotionally react to that big check. Celebrity and fame and popularity on radio and all that stuff can get us to incorrectly ascribe value to something. We can say that song must not be as good because it's not as popular. This songwriter might not be as good a songwriter because he's not making as much money or isn't as famous. That's not a biblical definition of success or what we're supposed to be doing when it comes, as a worship leader now I'm saying this, our job isn't supposed to be entertaining and propping up any kind of industry, right? I mean, that's not really what the body of Christ is there for. Our job as the industry is to, in this particular case, is to support the church. So if you can redefine what success is for you as a songwriter and as a worship leader and say, my job is to lead God's people into worship, to prepare their hearts to receive the word when it's taught, to engage them into the sacraments, that's success. If that happens, who cares which songs you used to do it and if it was popular or not? So take some time to really think and meditate on how you define success in your job and then respond accordingly. But don't blame shift it off to the bad guys in Nashville decide what songs are popular, and then dismiss it. Because it's your job to decide what your congregation is going to do.
We'll go over that side next.
Chelsea Axford. I lead, worship, direct, coordinate, a lot of all those words in Holland, Michigan. And really short. My question is really in the same vein as kind of where we're coming from. And my question has to do with the fact that I don't really make very much money, and I know most of us don't as worship leaders. How can we still be really good stewards of what artists are giving us? As far as, I haven't bought a CD in, probably I don't even know how long, 6 years or so. And I know that can't be the only way. Is it beneficial for the artists to be using Spotify? Is it beneficial to the artists to be using your website and things like that?
Yes, is the short answer. Honestly, it's it's a little bit the Wild West right now on how people get paid. Like Steve said, the whole business got turned upside down, and there's a lot of change in it. But my belief is they're not all equal right now. But over time, if you engage with an artist's music, they're getting compensated for it. The rights holders are. A lot of that happens above my pay grade. There's a lot of decisions being made in Washington right now. So I'm not going to, I don't want to be too idealistic and just assume it's all going to take care of itself. There's a lot of work to still be done. But what we know is, yes, iTunes is good for artists. Spotify is good for artists. CCLI tries to be fair and good to artists. So it's tough for them. I don't think any of you would know how hard they work, and this is not meant to be a pity party. They're really paid fairly, but they make an enormous sacrifice, mostly in their personal life and being away from their families, to do what they do. And I think any way you can engage with and support their music, they appreciate it. It's meaningful to them.
I would just add, think of it as a food pyramid. Spotify is your cheapest cost of entry. That's great for discovering stuff. When you find things you love, then I would encourage you to buy that song on iTunes, But the big thing is we've lost publications, magazines, all of the ways we used to be able to get the word out about music. Most of them are gone. So what we have in its place is this cacophony of social networking. If you find something you love, tell everybody in your world that you love it and provide them a link on your Facebook page to the Spotify link for them to hear it. Because that virality is all we have most of the time. It's either Christian radio or viral. That's pretty much the only way people are going to find out about new artists. So the ones you love, take the extra time and tell other people about them, and do it a few times, because that makes a huge difference to their year. As those numbers accumulate and more people, the viral thing is very, very powerful.
I'm going to ask, we're just about done, but if we could have 2 comments, and over here first, and then Claudio next, and then if you make your comments, brief responses, and then I'll close the morning session.
Well, I was struck about the comments regarding the songs of lament and confession and things like that. And particularly, I take a look at Radiohead, bands like that, Radiohead and Death Cab for Cutie, who have basically marketed themselves on nihilism, empathy themes, and they have these huge followings worldwide. So I'm struck that the fact that record companies outside of kind of a Christian worldview context have decided to latch on to that kind of marketing target audience. And, I was thinking about that and comparing that to whether, I'm wondering why Christian contemporary record labels have chosen not to, say, use that target market. And furthermore, if we think about Jamie Smith's writing about how culture is informed, or we, even as Christians, are informed by culture. Myself, I'm 30 years old, and I've only known the current industry as it's functioned previous to this, where it's been void for the majority of my life, for the majority of my time in ministry, from those songs of lament. And so where does the ethical responsibility lie for, is it the industry, is it for us ourselves who have not been within a culture that has said these things are valuable elements of worship? Does that make sense?
Great. Let's get Claudio's comment in, and then final response from panel.
Yeah, my question is about representation. Who's there? Who can be there? And since you pay to make profit, how much of the representation can play in terms of international music, in terms of who's there representing some different cultures, different communities? Can you think about that? Can you think about and international music, how you do if the language is different and if there's a possibility for that? So it's about representation. Can you think about that when you do choose your songs?
Oh, yeah. Well,
responses to these 2 comments, yeah.
On that one, I'll say we have sub-publishers and partners all over the world. So Brazil, for instance, we have a partner down in Brazil, and so I've been getting a steady stream of Brazilian worship music in Portuguese, and I've been feeding that out sometimes to some of our writers. We have a band that the label group just signed, pretty sure, right? Yeah. And because sometimes we publish things that the label group doesn't put out, but they're from Colombia and Miami, and they came into town, and they're a worship. What's it? It's Soulfire Revolution. So yes, we're very mindful because we're operating all over the world. A lot of times, indigenous music in our different territories around the world stays relatively indigenous because, again, you can put some things up on the salad bar, but that doesn't mean that the white American church wants it. But I do believe that because of the internet, there's increasing availability of international forms. It just takes more digging. So we can't, we're neutral in that. We can make it available, but it's up to the church to say we want to really, but now it's not just about doing a new song, it's about doing a song in a different language or with a different cultural feel. But yes, we're very excited about that. And the other one is interesting. We'll probably have to talk about that, offline or something. But I would say, have you heard of the Violet Burning? Have you heard of the Choir? Have you heard of any of these bands that have been doing gospel-tinged songs of lament for years? That's been my whole career, has been that world. And the Christian music industry, like I said, has had times when they've embraced it, but a lot of times you just have to go dig harder for it. And there's a lot of music that is covering that stuff that's just not going to rise to the top. And I don't think that it would anymore if we promoted it heavily on Worship Together, because that's not really what the majority of the church wants. But I do think there's a qualitative psychological difference between Radiohead's version of Despair and a Christian's version of lament. And lament, from a biblical perspective, demands response and action, which popular music doesn't tend to want to do. So I just wrote an article on Leonard Cohen's song, Hallelujah, that just was published yesterday. A book came out just about that song and about how it's sort of a secular hymn that means whatever you bring to it. So there's a very different set of agendas there that would take a whole other day to unpack. But there is a lot of music that's probably what you want. I just don't know if you've ever heard it.
Yeah, can I just say a word about the comment about Jamie Smith? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, too, that part of Jamie's point is that forms are not value neutral, whether they're forms of music, whether they're forms of doing business, that they shape us. And so that the church can't just receive its forms, but needs to be actively shaping the forms that it interacts with, that it uses in its worship. How does that happen? So I don't think we necessarily just receive from EMI, here is our form of doing business. But it's complex, because also EMI are people there are people there who are in churches, who are being shaped there, and their songs come from churches, so it's a complex relationship. And hopefully, that shaping is some of what we're doing here, having conversations between people who are involved in those cultural mechanisms, who are involved in producing those forms, and saying, here we are as the church, how can we both use and transform these elements? Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Brad and John and Stephen for their insights this morning. Great. And will you please join me in praying for them and for everyone involved in their congregation and company and the work that is done in Nashville. Let's pray. Lord our God, thank you so much for the insights that we've heard today. And now we pray for Stephen and Brad and John in their work. Thank you for the work to which you've called them and their desire to serve you through that work. We pray that you will encourage them, bless them in their work. We thank you so much for the conversation that has continued this morning and will continue beyond this, and for ways that we can function in a healthy way as part of your body. We are so grateful. Thank you so much also now for the food that has been prepared, for all those who have prepared it, and for the rich feast of fellowship that we can taste during this time together. To you all praise and glory in Jesus' name. Amen.